Something by Unitarian Universalist minister Tess Baumberger caught my attention recently when it was posted on Facebook. It begins, easily enough, with a question. Wouldn't it be great if you could take a picture of your soul? Then, when your mother wanted to brag about you, she could show people the picture and say, "That's my daughter. Doesn't she have a beautiful soul, all sparkly and many-coloured and flowing all around her?" It's certainly an intriguing idea. Suppose someone invented a device that could show who we really are, that could let us know as quickly as looking at a picture what it is that actually makes us us. I can certainly imagine that proud parents would be the first to make use of such pictures, to show others the beauty that they've already seen within their own children. Of course, once you've started imagining such a thing, well, you can't just leave it there. And so Baumberger continues, wouldn't it be great if we walked around surrounded by our souls, so that they were the first things people saw instead of the last things? Then people would judge us by who we really are, instead of how we look. Imagine no more racism, ageism, sexism, fatism, shortism, homophobia. Imagine falling in love with who a person is just by looking at them. It would be a shortcut, that's for sure. No more laborious, time-consuming process of getting to know somebody. No more relying on unreliable language to convey information that maybe can't even be put into words anyway. No more getting distracted by mere outward appearances. The possibilities for every relationship, whether passing acquaintance, business association, romantic intimacy, or social friendship, would instantly be based on the truest part of ourselves. It would be a lot harder to fool someone, or to be fooled ourselves. You can make the case, in fact, that there are such obvious advantages to visible souls that it shouldn't be optional, even if there will inevitably be some consequences to figure out. As Baumberger notes, it would be a kind of cloaking device, hiding physical faults, defects, or even perfections. I'd want it to be mandatory. Then people would work at making their souls more attractive instead of their bodies and their faces. So would this be merely a new form of vanity? Or would it instead be a more obvious way of pursuing self-improvement, with a more direct measure of how readily we are becoming our better selves? Either way, there are benefits, as Baumberger goes on to consider. Imagine people knowing by your soul that you really need a hug. Imagine people helping each other and their souls changing colours or growing. That would be really something. Seeing someone and knowing what will help. No more putting on a brave face when what we really need is someone to sit with us and say it will be okay. Compassion, generosity, encouragement, gratitude, these will no longer be considered in some abstract metaphysical sense, but will rather be understood as physical forces with immediately visible results. When all's said and done then, when our truest selves are apparent for everyone to see, who wouldn't want to get their soul into the best condition possible? And so, as Tess Baumberger concludes, imagine soul gyms with exercises to get your sagging soul into shape. Imagine the long lines forming for soul lifts at churches, temples, mosques, synagogues, or nature's grand cathedrals. And that, of course, is the whole point of Baumberger's otherwise fanciful meditation, to provide a great metaphor for why any religious community actually exists. Oh, there are lots of other things that churches and temples and mosques and synagogues do that often get confused for the real reason why they exist. The primary purpose of any religious group, after all, is not to have a building, though if it does have a building, it certainly needs to be maintained. It's not to employ staff, though if a congregation does employ staff, they certainly should be compensated fairly. Nor is it to have meetings, and unfortunately I can't imagine any organisation that wouldn't have meetings, but they should still be run as effectively as possible. And most importantly, perhaps, religion does not exist to raise money. Now, as those of you who have participated in this year's pledge drive know full well, money is needed for buildings and staff and programs and outreach and mission and ministry. But that's only because, just like those other things, money is also a means to some other end. So why do congregations actually exist? Some of my Christian colleagues will say that their churches exist to save souls. Well, saving souls is not a universal theology. My Jewish, Muslim and Buddhist colleagues will probably not say that their congregations exist to save souls, and yet you'll find some strong similarities in terms of their activities, from worship and religious education to pastoral care and prophetic outreach, though they might not use those precise words. What they are doing, practiced in whatever particular form and described in whatever religious vocabulary, is changing lives. Yes, congregations exist to change lives. Now, many of you here today probably didn't get up this morning and think to yourselves, well, I want to change my life. I think I'll go to the fellowship. I've talked with lots of people, from first-time visitors to those who've been here a few times, from brand new members to those who've been here for years. And not one of any of them has ever told me that they started coming here simply because they wanted to change their lives. And yet, here you all are, for reasons you might articulate that include seeing good friends, meeting new people, giving your child a liberal religious education, singing a good hymn or two, listening to some great music, sharing a joy or a sorrow with people who care, supporting a worthy cause, maybe even hearing a sermon somewhere in there. But think a little more about any of those reasons, and it's clear that they're changing your life too, whether that was your intention or not. Some of the reasons for coming here on a Sunday morning might be more obvious in terms of changing lives than others. Meeting someone new expands our horizons, changing our sense of who we are a little bit at the same time that we get to know another person. In joys and sorrows, of course, we explicitly ask you to share what is really, truly changing your life. And then both shared joy and sorrow will change those who hear you too. And I've always found that music, whether I'm singing it or not, changes me, even if it's just a temporary change in mood, though sometimes it is a longer-lasting motivation to want to go out there and change the world. Now, I've previously said that something we try to do in this particular congregation is embrace people as they are and value them for who they are already. But that's not incompatible with the congregation's primary purpose of changing lives. Actually, it's an essential part of it because none of us are finished works. All of us have room to grow, with effort still to put in on becoming our better selves. We're not always honest with ourselves about that, of course, but even there a religious community can help, not by pointing out flaws or by shaming, but by providing a safe space in which we're given the courage to take a good, long look at the shape of our own souls. It's not like being part of a congregation is the only way our lives will be changed anyway. When something truly good or something truly bad happens to us, there's no avoiding the change to our lives that inevitably results. The question is, will we be figuring out how to respond to that change all alone, by ourselves? Or will we be part of a community that will join us in celebrating the good, that will support us in grieving the bad? Religion is at its best, after all, when it can help us in these ways. Particularly at times of great joy and at times of great sorrow, we all need a community of the like-hearted that can support us by sharing in our struggle to find meaning. At other times in between, of course, we are here to do just that for other people, offering them compassion, generosity, encouragement, and gratitude, just as they have offered and will offer them to us when we need them. And not surprisingly, that changes our lives too. Everything we do, in fact, is part of our purpose to change lives, helping one another with individual spiritual development, serving those who are suffering from disease or loss or hardship, teaching our children that religion is not about hate, but about love, calling our civic leaders to account when they indulge special interests rather than work for the public good, coming together in the spirit of good company to enjoy food, fellowship, and fun. And I bet you were all changed a little bit by doing the UU Hokey Pokey this morning too. Everything we do, all of it, is about changing lives. To return to Tess Baumberger's metaphor, we can think of this congregation as like a gym for our souls, a place where we can go to exercise our spiritual muscles by practicing the gratitude, compassion, and hope that we need to be fully human throughout the week. We do that, in the words of our reading by UU Minister Kenneth Patton, not in bowing down, not with closed eyes and stopped ears, but by choosing to love the world through heart and mind and body. And thus he defines worship as the act of opening all the windows of our being with the full outstretching of our spirits. It is, in short, about falling in love with life. Continuing in that vein, there were then the words of our hymn from W.H. Auden's Canzone on what the world teaches us about the tension between what we want and what we love. Happiness, after all, has been defined not as having what you want, but as wanting what you have. And there's a lesson in there about congregational life too. Of course, changing people's individual lives to get our own souls into shape, if you like, is just one side of the transformation that a congregation hopes to bring about. We're also here to nurture the collective life and soul of the community, and to make the world a better place too. Both of these are part and parcel of opening all the windows of our being with the full outstretching of our spirits. So let me say something about one piece of the collective life and soul of the community, of this community. As I hope all of you have heard by now, particularly if you are a member of this congregation, we'll be voting on some revisions to the fellowship's bylaws after services next Sunday. And if you are a member, which means that you get to vote on such things, we really need you to attend that special membership meeting in order to meet the 40% quorum requirement. So please do make a point of planning to attend. These revisions are in large part an implementation of the reorganization to our committees that the Council of Committees and others have been working on now for over 3 years. A restructuring of how we make decisions and get work done that will help shape us into the congregation we are on the verge of becoming, rather than holding us back as the congregation that we used to be. Now, in the course of this, perhaps as a result of clearing out closets, as a result of the remediation from the pipe that burst in the kitchen last year and the subsequent refurbishment that we did, a copy of the UUFP's bylaws from 1981 showed up. Or actually, I should say the UFP, because at that time the congregation's name was still the Unitarian Fellowship of the Peninsula and not yet the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. In any case, it's interesting to see who was on the board of directors back in 1981, just after the congregation had built and then moved into this building, because there's an important lesson there. For starters, there were the 4 standard officers of just about any organization: president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. But also on the board 35 years ago were the person who did the canvas and fundraising, the person who organised Sunday morning programmes, the person who ran the children's RE programme, the person who maintained the buildings and grounds, and the person who edited the newsletter. In other words, this was a board that did a lot of management, because it was mostly made up of the people responsible for making things happen here, for actually doing those things. And for a small congregation, significantly smaller back in 1981 than we are now, well, that's the way it should be, because that's how such a small congregation needs to organize and run itself. But that's not who we are as a congregation in 2016. For one thing, a board of directors mostly made up of the people who are managing this congregation today simply would not be able to function. There would be at least a couple of dozen people on that board. Their meetings would last for hours and hours and hours, and that would only just be for everyone to report on what they're doing. They wouldn't actually have time ever to make any decisions. So instead of that unwieldy structure, we have a policy board made up of people charged with paying attention to goals and priorities and mission, which is, in other words, the work of leadership. The management of the congregation is then delegated to committees and staff. For another thing, the challenge as a significantly larger congregation than we were 35 years ago is to organize all of those committees so that they can get their work done, working together when necessary, but at least not working at cross purposes. And that's why the proposed bylaws have committees either directly supporting the work of the board, a handful of them, and the other couple of dozen committees grouped together in areas of common concern, because they don't need to report to the board. Now, if you think that this is an odd thing for me to preach about in a sermon, well, one of the primary tasks of a minister is to remind each and every congregant that their individual interests can only be met if the congregation itself is vibrant and healthy and functions as an integrated organization. After all, we are not only here to get our own souls into shape, but also to grow and develop our fellowship soul, because congregational life needs to be healthy if it's going to help us find wholeness and comfort and courage in our own lives. And since we're also part of a wider society beyond the fellowship's walls, part of the interdependent web of all existence, the same is true for the whole world. Since we're all in this together, each of us is only free when everyone is free. Each of us can only reach for our dreams when everyone can reach for their dreams. Each of us can only embrace life abundant when everyone can embrace life abundant. And I'm convinced that the best way to make that happen, to turn that vision into reality, is to be a part of a congregation just like this one. So perhaps we can think of church as a gym for our souls. But if so, it's also a gym that gets into better shape right along with us. And while the soul of this congregation isn't any more visible than any person's, I for one know that it's already all sparkly and many-coloured and flowing all around everyone here, because I can see the results. For this is a place that offers the gratitude and compassion and hope that we need in our everyday lives, a place where we learn to open all the windows of our being, where we practice wholeness every time we gather, where we bring together heart and mind, voice and hand, individual and community, person and world. So may it be.